When a single-dad CEO stood up for a shy, deaf girl on a blind date, nobody in the boardroom who planned it imagined what that would cost them, or what it would build. The plan began where small cruelties are made germane, a fluorescent-lit mezzanine with glass railings and framed quarterly reports. Kyle tapped a pen against his notebook like a metronome to his irritation. Bonnie scrolled through a social feed of charity galas and felt, with the slow burn of resentment, that Daniel Reed's good publicity had become a wedge in every promotion conversation. Max, who had learned to box his anger into spreadsheets, supplied the camera, a tiny dome they could hide near the restaurant's upper rail. Just enough to catch him, Max said, voice flat. One smug posture, a cheesy line, that'll be the end of the saintly CEO story. They rehearsed a version of the evening that made them laugh in low, dangerous tones. In their version, Daniel would be exposed as performative kindness, a man of press releases without substance. In their version, Lena Park would be a prop, the quiet, shy woman who, because of her reserve, would be easy to fluster. They imagined viral clips, whispered office jokes, promotions that would no longer tilt toward empathy, but toward whoever could manipulate perception better. What they did not imagine, because it was not theirs to imagine, was the steady, private logic that carries a man who has learned to balance grief and parenthood. They did not account for the little hands that tugged at Daniel's sleeve at 3 a.m, begging for a story about a roaring, tiny dinosaur. Or the way his daughter insisted he learn to sign the word for bedtime because it made her feel safer when storms came. They did not see how those small acts had retuned him, how his public persona, the scrupulous CEO with the kind op-eds, was rooted in practice, not performance. Daniel Reed kept the office's glass-walled world separate from the rituals of his apartment. Toy trucks lined up on the windowsill. A sweater draped over the back of a chair, because Ruby, his 6-year-old, loved leaving things in curious places. An embroidered handkerchief folded in a drawer, a remnant of a life before the silence tightened around birthdays and holidays. He had not wanted a new headline, he wanted a rhythm. School nap times, PTA emails, a steady hand when Ruby's small body shook with grief she did not yet have words for. The world thought him composed. He worked to remain that way, because composure made space for others. They chose Riverside Grill for the easy angles and the mezzanine view. It was an old riverside place whose far windows caught the sunset like spilled coin. The management liked the business, the city liked the photograph. It felt, to the conspirators, like the perfect stage. They asked a colleague who worked the floor to reserve a table that looked down toward the mezzanine, and to be sure the camera's line of sight was unbroken. "Discreet," Kyle said, like a surgeon who wanted no visible scar. Lena Park did not belong in the world of corporate rivalry or strategic humiliation. She belonged to a quieter geography. Libraries with worn bindings, volunteer lists for local nonprofit newsletters, and a habit of collecting quotes that felt like anchors. She wrote about accessibility because it mattered. She wrote about small acts that changed daily life. When a mutual acquaintance asked if she'd consider a blind date, she hesitated with the kind of calculation reserved for people who had learned to measure the energy of rooms. She was shy, yes, but not brittle. She had consented to more than one social experiment in her life, reading a room, testing the friendliness of strangers, and learned that people offered kindness in different dialects. Sometimes kindness arrived as a companionable silence. Sometimes it arrived in words. On the evening she agreed, Lena chose a dark blue dress because it felt like a private uniform. She tucked a small notebook into her bag, a habit that made her feel prepared. She packed a pair of simple studs, a thin bracelet her sister had given her. She practiced in the tiny, private shape of her hands a short self-introduction. "Hello, I'm Lena." She had a list of questions she liked to ask people to decode them gently. What was a small kindness they'd once received? What was the last thing they read that changed them? She would ask, she thought, and then listen.
Riverside was luminous that night, a wash of candlelight and the soft clink of silverware. The air smelled of lemon and grilled thyme. The dining room folded around them in gentle acoustics. Daniel arrived first, carrying the precise, casual weight of a man who moved between classrooms and boardrooms. A blazer over a t-shirt, so Ruby could still burst in at any moment without his look becoming a performance. Ruby had insisted on bringing her triceratops, a plastic, stubborn thing that roared in the way she wanted stories to end, with small, emphatic victory. Daniel set the dinosaur on a spare chair and smoothed his hand over a napkin, checking his phone with a reflex against distraction. He had been learning to sign in fits and practices, not fluently. No one could mistake his earliest signs for native rhythm. They had the hesitant cadence of someone who learned between diaper changes and late-night conference calls. He had learned the essentials first: please, thank you, the names of common foods his daughter loved. He had learned more and all done and story. He signed with Ruby at bedtime, mismatched and forgiving. Sometimes Ruby corrected him with the precise, unforgiving joy of a child who knows the right way and wants you to try again. When Lena entered, she moved like someone who was simultaneously attentive to the world and protected from it. Her eyes scanned the room with a practiced subtlety, taking in lights and people and the way other diners tilted into each other.
She smiled as she found the table. Daniel stood, and for a moment there was the polite choreography of two strangers measuring how far to go. He offered his hand. She placed hers lightly, and then did something he appreciated. She signed a quick hello, not theatrical but clear. He gave a small, pleased nod and returned the sign with measured fingers, his face shaping the sentence the way the ear shapes words. "Nice to meet you," he signed. His hands had a stiffness that made the motion compact, as if the language was being refolded into him. Her face shifted with a glimmer of surprise, not because he knew sign, but because she saw without the need for a translator the intention in him, that he had made the effort. She responded with a sign that was precise, her eyebrows emphasizing a little question: repetition? Confirmation? While her smile opened like the first page of a book that trusts the reader. They settled into an exchange that felt at once tentative and immediate. He spoke softly, aware for once of the domestic audience at the table next to them, of the way sound curves and bounces in public places. She answered with short sentences and signs, her fingers delicate and economical, and he listened. When the waiter approached, he signed for Lena and then interpreted out loud so the waiter would not feel dismissed. It was the sort of action that could have been magnanimous, the kind that announced an imbalance, but Daniel did it with a near breathless normality. "He likes the sea bass tonight," he said softly to Lena after the waiter explained. She laughed, a small exhale of approval, and then signed something about preferring risotto. They both agreed, and the decision dissolved into the fine work of choosing. The water spill came not as a catastrophe but as a small breach. Across the room a young woman gestured too widely, and the glass on her table tipped. Water arced like thin glass, and found the hem of Lena's dress. The motion that followed was a kind of choreography that revealed character more clearly than any speech ever could. Lena's face registered annoyance. Moreover, an old habitual recoil that people have when they have been made suddenly visible for reasons they did not choose. She moved to stand, to brush at damp fabric, to make a small attempt at self-repair. The table hummed with the murmur that happens when someone's evening shifts into maintenance. Daniel reached into his jacket and drew a handkerchief. It was not an ordinary square of cloth, but one with an embroidered corner he had kept after a long-ago life. A pale, looping initial from his wife. The sight of it tightened something in him, a tenderness that had little to do with romance or public image and everything to do with memory. He unfolded it and, without fanfare, laid it across Lena's lap like a gentle claim of care. He moved his chair a fraction closer to offer his jacket, shrugged out of it, and draped it over her shoulders the way a parent would for a child, careful not to make the exchange spectacle. Lena felt the warmth of the jacket, and for the first time that evening let her shoulders unclench. She signed "Thank you," and her facial grammar softened. It was small and contained, the sort of gratitude that reserved mountains of caution for later. Daniel smiled in the way of someone who had learned to respond with acts rather than statements. He folded the handkerchief and placed it beside his plate, not making a show of the embroidered thread, but letting it be a small witness to tenderness. Across the mezzanine, Kyle leaned forward over the railing, the camera tucked like a secret in the crook of his arm. Bonnie's phone was aglow in the dim, Max's jaw tight. A smirk threatened on Kyle's face when he thought of the clips that would follow. The fluster, the forced apology, a line he could take out of context and make a story. He texted, sent the live line, and watched the feed tilt and reframe them all. But what they recorded was not a collapse into comic exposure. What the tiny dome caught, through the grain of glass and the pixel shimmer of a cheap lens, were gestures that turned spectacle into something else. A man reading a room, a woman offering small corrections to his signing when he stumbled. Lena, when she told a story about a past project for a nonprofit, used her hands not to beseech but to explain. Daniel leaned in. He noticed how she delayed when the story reached a painful hinge and simply waited. He asked a clarifying question with his fingertips and then, for safety more than show, translated her sign to the waiter in a tone that made the waiter feel included without making Lena dependent. Ruby, far from the mezzanine, might have watched this differently in Daniel's mind. He imagined telling her later, in the softened glow of the kitchen, the exact way Lena had laughed, and the way her hands had corrected his fingers when he missigned charity for charitable. Ruby would delight in the triceratops, he thought, and demand to know if Lena liked dinosaurs. Daniel liked that possibility, that a person could be folded into the life of a child without fanfare. He had, over many small evenings, reshaped his life into a vessel for such tenderness. "Stay with us," a voice might have said, an editor's whisper in the narrator's ear. But Daniel did not think in sound bites. He simply continued, listening and responding. If you are watching this unfold, watch what happens when kindness is tested. The meal moved with the soft rhythm of two people discovering a shared tempo. Lena spoke about her work and the small joys she found in crafting newsletters that invited readers into action without shaming them.
Daniel spoke about board decisions that had felt like moral chess, and about the awkwardness of teaching himself to read a new language because a small hand had needed it. They exchanged stories that were not confessions, but maps, the kind that let each see the other's landscape without trespassing. At one point, Lena reached for her cup and her knuckle brushed the embroidered handkerchief. She looked at the initial and asked, with a half-sign and half-voiced question, if the handkerchief had been his wife's. Daniel's face settled into something that was not sorrowful spectacle, but quiet, precise grief. He answered with a short story about a person who had taught him to read the light in children's eyes and to make room at the bedside for the small rituals that make a home. He did not ask for pity. He only offered the truth, and then turned the conversation back to her by asking what small ritual had anchored her. She signed back about a pot of tea and a playlist she returned to when winter made the city feel like a slow blessing. The kitchen at Riverside hummed under the waitstaff's feet, and a band in the corner played a low cover of a song that had been on the radio the night his wife died. Daniel noticed the memory like a bruise. He swallowed the memory down and let the evening move. Memorable souls are not those who avoid memory. They are those who hold it and then turn the torchlight outward. After the entree, the atmosphere loosened. Conversation flitted into small confessions. First concerts, biggest fears, what would be missed if tomorrow never came. Lena spoke about the day she first realized the practical power of small signage, a bus route that suddenly had a visible ramp, and how that altered her sense of belonging in the city. Daniel listened as he had been trained to do, with an openness that made replies precise and not presumptuous. He signed something about doors and ways to hold them open, and Lena responded with a shy, quick series of signs about the people who had helped her learn to ask for space. Each exchange tightened a thread between them. On the mezzanine, Kyle and his cohort watched with the impatience of people who had invested emotional currency in an outcome. "We're not getting the clip," Bonnie hissed. "We're getting a human moment. This isn't—" She stopped. Kyle glowered, bewildered by the fact that their trap, for all its plotting, was being eaten by life. Daniel, in his turn, noticed the odd reflection on the glass behind Lena. For a moment, he thought it might be a street lamp. Then, the way the reflection lingered and the angle made no sense, he felt a small mechanical unease. It was not yet a certainty. He did not want to be paranoid. He folded the gesture into a distracted thought and let it sit, a pebble in his shoe. The meal moved toward dessert. Ruby's triceratops, waiting in the car seat at home, would be the inciting prop of a bedtime story Daniel promised himself he would make longer than usual.
He imagined Lena and Ruby together in a kitchen he'd never had before, not as a performance, but as a small, chosen constellation. He liked the image of them making tough, slightly burnt cookies and laughing at the way Ruby corrected his signs. A passing server knocked a candle, the flame wavered, and in the low light, Lena's face became a study in focus, eyes narrowing to read the waiter's lips and hands lifting to clarify. Daniel followed the motion like a secondary echo. His fingers mimicked hers in a question he did not voice. When the candle was steadied, Lena relaxed enough to tell a small joke about burnt cookies and the way she once overbaked a batch that her neighbor declared edible art. Daniel laughed, and the laugh was honest, the way a man lets out the pressure of something held upright. It is easy at moments like this to imagine that nothing will intrude on the small miracle of worldly decency. It is easy to believe that cups will not tip and lenses will not spy. But the world keeps its cautions in its pockets. The dome camera, designed to capture ridicule, continued to watch. In the camera's feed, faces looked flatter, and the commentators on the mezzanine hunched in anticipation of something that did not arrive. Daniel's unease returned as a light, prickling awareness. He noticed where the shadow fell in the glass and where the glass refracted the candlelight. When he shifted in his seat, he saw something else, a black dot at the mezzanine's rail in the exact place Kyle had sent an earlier text. His first impulse was to be angry, to marshal a response that would make the conspirators embarrass themselves. But he had spent a season learning what anger looks like on a child's face and how it ripples across small lives. He thought of Ruby reading a bedtime story interrupted by a father who chose spectacle over repair. He chose, for that fraction of a moment, to gather information rather than to let the evening splinter. He signed to Lena, not loudly, but in a way that folded her into the thought. "Excuse me," his hands said, the motion careful, inviting. She looked at him with that slight, questioning tilt of her head that had become a ritual between them in the space of the meal. He stood and moved to the window where the glass separated him from the mezzanine light. He could see, now more clearly, the tiny bulge of a lens and a man who looked at them through the frame. Daniel took a breath that calibrated equal parts grief and resolve. He looked back at the table where Lena sat, shoulders unguarded, and the picket fence he maintained around his child's life tightened for a moment. The ethical choice, the one that bore on this man who had been widowed and had learnt to practice tenderness as a daily discipline, presented itself with the flat, undeniable shape of consequence. He could expose them and make their cruelty public in a way that delighted the very instincts that had plotted the prank. Humiliation, retribution, the delicious jut of a fallen idol. Or he could do something else. He folded his jacket, smoothed it across his arm, and walked back to the table with the quiet step of someone who had rehearsed civility in 1,000 bedtime stories. He did not storm. He did not raise his voice. He sat and for a moment let the room's sound press against his ribs. He signed again, slowly, to Lena, letting each syllable be care. "This might be a camera. Are you okay if I check?" Lena looked at him, and, with the same composed reserve that had carried her through so many small adjustments in life, she nodded.
Her fingers moved, a small, succinct sign that said yes in a way that meant consent and trust. Daniel appreciated the consent as he appreciated the handkerchief, not as a token, but as a sign that he had entered a space that required mutual respect. He rose, aware that the eyes along the mezzanine sharpened at any motion, and walked with measured purpose toward the railing. The camera was a small black eye within a circle of plastic. Kyle and his friends were visible behind it, their faces elongated by their own investment. Daniel did not shout across the room. He did not fling accusations like confetti. He looked at Kyle and the others with a composure that made anger, oddly, more visible in its absence. He leaned against the railing and, with the quiet of someone who knows an ethical line when he sees it, he spoke in a voice that slid across the air like a careful hand. "I see your camera." There was a silence that made the band in the corner drop the volume as if the world had suddenly acquired an extra listener. The camera's light blinked. Kyle's eyes flickered, guilty and then angry. And Bonnie's face gained that defensive tightness people get when they realize they've been caught by a conscience they did not consult. Max's jaw clenched. The moment widened into something that the conspirators had not intended, a moral gaze with no punchline. Daniel stepped back and, in the calm manner that had become his practice, signed across the table toward Lena, then spoke aloud. "We're not a spectacle. If you want to make this right, let's do it properly." His tone was not pleading. It was instead a ledger, a clear accounting of what dignity required. He did not seek to humiliate them. He sought to force an ethical inventory, exposure of the act, apology, and a process that restored boundaries. His request was a set of instructions for repair rather than a cry for vengeance. From up above, Kyle's face went a color that was neither remorse nor understanding, but the awkward red of someone suddenly aware that positional power does not mean moral right. The other patrons lifted their heads. Some watched with bored curiosity, others with protective instinct. For a brief, suspended second, the restaurant held a collective breath. Lena sat very still. She watched Daniel as if being observed by a new kind of light. In her face, there were no tears, only measurement. She signed once compactly. "Thank you." Her fingers were steady. It was the first quiet vote of trust he had been given that evening. Daniel nodded, not as leader, but as someone who knew being trusted was a kind of responsibility. On the mezzanine, the camera's tiny lens had captured their facade of plotting, but the feed showed something else too. The way a man shows repair over revenge, and the way a woman, usually cautious, permitted herself a moment of being held. The conspirators had aimed for ridicule, and had instead made visible a quiet bravery that did not depend on spectacle. It was in that precarious space, the tilt between exposure and reckoning, that other decisions would have to be made. Daniel's next move, conscientious and deliberate, was not to mete out punishment, but to define integrity. He knew, from the smallest conversations with Ruby, and from nights when grief softened into tenderness, that how you correct a wrong says more about your character than how you react in anger. He inhaled, and the scent of lemon and candied thyme filled his lungs. He looked at Lena with a small, steady gentleness, and then, with a voice that did not seek to dominate the room, asked, "Would you like to come somewhere quieter? We can talk about this away from them." Lena's fingers formed an answer that was more than yes or no. They contained nuance, the sort of deliberation people who have been watched learn to do. She looked toward the mezzanine and then at Daniel, whose expression asked for an answer that was not performative. Her small nod folded into a clearer decision. She would move, but not because anyone told her to, because she chose to step with a person who had not made her into a punchline. As they stood, the restaurant's light shifted to a softer amber. The camera on the mezzanine watched, its lens reflecting back a room that had chosen, in that moment, its better self. Kyle's face was a study in private bewilderment. Bonnie's hands trembled. Max stared at the floor as if it would provide a ready solution that metrics never had. They left the table quietly, with the sort of small composure that meant nothing dramatic and everything decisive. Daniel kept one hand near his pocket, the embroidered handkerchief a small weight against whatever came next. Lena removed the jacket with an economy that showed she was not unaccustomed to practical moves in public. He opened the door for her and then, by reflex and by the grammar he'd learned with his daughter and his life, nodded to the host with a succinct thank you. Outside, the river breathed under the city with a smell of wet concrete and the promise of winter. The street was cooler than the room and held a strip of night that felt private.
Daniel and Lena paused under a lamppost, the light catching the movement of their hands like a small lighthouse. The choice ahead was not a climax, but a hinge. They could walk away into the night and shield the moment, or they could return, mechanics and all, to a public that had watched too willingly. Daniel thought of how to make this right. He chose, in that breath, to do what his life had been quietly coached toward, to stand publicly not for himself, but for the dignity of another. He would return to the restaurant to insist on repair not as spectacle, but as a form of ethics. He would ask that the conspirators be held accountable in ways that taught rather than humiliated. He would insist the footage be deleted and that apologies be made, in person and under witness, with a process that might restore boundaries instead of shredding them. Lena watched him with an expression that was hard to read only to anyone who insisted on reading people by their loudness. Her reserve had always been a careful map. Tonight, it felt like a compass. She signed quietly, a sentence that meant, "I trust you," a phrase that in its brevity held a whole conversation about consent and consent-giving, and Daniel folded that trust into his bones. At the restaurant, the lights still held the gentle hum of normality. Inside, conversations resumed, lowered decibels mending like stitches. The mezzanine hummed with a new kind of embarrassment, the one that arrives when you realize you have been betting on someone else's fall. Kyle's text feed cooled, Bonnie's shoulders drooped. A small ethical reckoning had begun, not with spectacle, but with the human labor of making amends. Daniel took Lena's hand for a second at the threshold, not to steady her, but to communicate in the vocabulary they had invented over a single meal, the promise of a careful companion. Then he stepped back into the room, the restaurant watching, and asked aloud, with the firmness of someone who measured words before speaking, "Let's talk about how we make this right. Let's talk about how we make this right." The sentence folded the room into a new shape. Voices that had been mounting into a background hum went still. Silverware paused mid-tilt. Daniel's request was not a performance. It had the unshowy gravity of someone who had spent long nights teaching a child how to sleep well again, practical, patient, unwilling to let the work be undone by spectacle. The host came over with a careful smile and an edge of alarm. Daniel explained what he'd seen and asked that the restaurant contact its manager. The manager, polite and mid-practice at diffusing public incidents, nodded and disappeared toward the mezzanine. Daniel stayed seated, his hands in his lap, the embroidered handkerchief folded and quiet on the table, like a reminder stitched into the texture of ordinary life. Lena sat beside him, the jacket across her shoulders as if it had quietly landed there and become part of the evening's armor. Up on the mezzanine, Kyle's grin had been replaced by a shallow, sudden anxiety. The manager's approach was brisker than he expected. Someone had to explain choosing to stream another person's private space. The tiny camera's lens, exposed, looked less like a weapon and more like a child's marble, falsely opaque and terribly reflective. Kyle opened his mouth to make a joke and found the words clogged. The footage was taken down from whatever casual stream Kyle had intended. The manager, uncomfortable and efficient, insisted the restaurant's policy didn't allow private filming and offered to delete the file immediately.
Daniel accepted the deletion on the surface, but asked to verify the action formally. He asked that the manager sign a brief statement confirming the deletion and the actions taken. He asked the restaurant to escort Kyle and his friends out of the premises. As they left, Daniel requested a private conversation with Kyle and the other men. It was not vengeance he wanted, it was accountability. He wanted them to say, out loud, what they had intended and to face the human cost of that intention. He wanted Lena's dignity restored, not exploited for a cheap public lesson. In the restaurant's small office, with the river's low thrum through the windows, Kyle's defenses came out like a first clumsy draft. He muttered about demonstrating performative leadership and how the company's public face had become a wedge in the promotion cycle. Bonnie tried to laugh it off, to make the episode sound like a harmless prank that had simply gone too far. Max avoided looking up. Daniel listened. When he spoke, his voice was not loud, it was colder than a shout. He named what had happened with clinical clarity. You put a camera to catch a person in a private interaction. You treated someone like a prop to score promotions. That isn't a joke, it's a violation. He laid out a path forward. An apology to Lena, witnessed and sincere. A written acknowledgement of wrongdoing. Mandatory participation in sensitivity and ethics training. And a meeting with human resources that would determine appropriate professional consequences. He added two things that surprised them. He wanted them required to support a community accessibility program, hours of volunteer work with local nonprofits that Lena's organization cooperated with. And he asked the firm to host a company-wide session on consent and privacy that would be led by experts, not by management-sanitized slides. Kyle's face went pale. He had expected a firing or a viral humiliation. Instead, Daniel proposed labor, uncomfortable, meaningful work that might change behavior rather than simply punish it. That prospect unsettled him more than any public spectacle could. Later that week, at the company's all-hands meeting, Daniel addressed the staff. He named the incident without reveling in the salacious.
He explained the steps he'd asked for: the apology, the community service, the HR review, the deletion, and documentation. He refused to show the footage. He said, plainly, that the company would be held to higher standards of conduct because its leaders had a duty to model integrity. He also invited Lena, if she wished, to speak about accessibility and dignity, not to be put on display, but to inform policy, to let her expertise shape the company's training. The boardroom, usually a place of fiscal calm, had an edge the next morning. Kyle, Bonnie, and Max received formal letters. Mandatory ethics training, temporary reassignment away from client-facing roles, and a required restorative engagement with a local nonprofit that worked on disability awareness and inclusion. The letters were firm but not theatrical. Some people in the office whispered that Daniel had been lenient. Others felt the relief that came from seeing leadership choose repair over revenge. Kyle resigned a month later. It had less to do with the disciplinary measures than with the way his colleagues looked at him, no longer as a rising star, but as someone whose judgment had been compromised by pettiness. Bonnie was moved to a different department and later enrolled in a workplace empathy course. Max, who had once used numbers to contain everything, began attending the restorative sessions and later spoke awkwardly at one of the company's internal forums about how he had misread charisma as competence. The consequences were social and professional. They were not dramatic, but they were enduring. Through it all, Lena moved with the quiet economy that had become her habit. She agreed to the apology meeting not because she needed vindication, but because she wanted rules to change. The meeting happened in a small conference room bathed in filtered light. Kyle offered a stringed, uncertain apology. Bonnie sobbed quietly and said she had felt small, never having achieved the recognition she sought. Max apologized with a measured voice. Lena accepted the apologies on her own terms. She asked questions that redirected the shame back into systems. How will you prevent this next time? Who will be accountable? She did not play the hurt or the role of a victim.
She was precise about boundaries and specific in her requests. Daniel watched her, and what he felt was not heroism, but deep relief. Relief that someone he had just met could meet wrong with demand for better practice rather than spectacle. He felt, too, the quiet satisfaction that comes when a child's bedtime ritual turns into the grammar of how one treats others. Consistent, small acts that remake the world. In the months that followed, there were no clumsy victories. There were, however, 100 small successes. The company's new accessibility initiative began with a modest grant to local organizations doing hands-on work.
There were workshops about communication strategies and listening exercises. Staff volunteers learned how to write alt text, how to create meeting agendas that honored various needs, how to check for consent before amplifying someone's image. Lena consulted on the curriculum, shaping the content with a practiced hand. She did not condescend. She explained, in ways both practical and humane, how small design decisions changed daily life. The public attention that the conspirators had hoped for never arrived. In its place grew a steadier kind of change. Daniel's leadership, measured and consistent, became less about press releases and more about policy. People who had once envied his image began to see the work behind it. The company, in turn, learned an awkward, valuable lesson. Integrity was not as catchy as a scandal, but it lasted longer. Away from corporate corridors, the rest of the story was quieter and more domestic. Lena and Daniel began, slowly, to inhabit the same spaces. They did not sign a lease together overnight. There were months of commuting, evenings of potluck dinners where Ruby would collapse into an adult lap with the ferocity of the very young, and mornings where Daniel would walk Lena to the bus, both of them warmed by a coffee and the kind of easy silences that do not demand explanation. Ruby did what children do. She inserted herself into the formation of new relationships like a comet adjusting orbit. At first, she watched Lena with the caution children usually reserve for the unknown. Then she began to bring her triceratops to the meetings, and every time Lena laughed at the dinosaur's stubborn roar, Ruby decided that the woman could be trusted. Lena, for her part, opened a drawer in her apartment and kept the small embroidered handkerchief Daniel had used that night. She did not keep it as talismanic proof of a rescue. She kept it as a story-marked object that reminded her of the way someone had chosen repair over spectacle. They built rituals. Wednesday nights became baking nights, which meant flour on the counter and an abundance of burnt cookies to decorate with anatomically exuberant sprinkles. Ruby taught Lena a secret method for obtaining an even sign for chocolate that involved 2 rapid, neat taps and a bright smile. Daniel learned to knead not just dough, but silence, allowing his hands to work while conversation failed him. He learned to ask and then to wait for answers, signed or spoken. ASL in their household was a living thing. Daniel's signing, which had been earnest and halting on that first night, grew more natural. He practiced at home with Ruby and with recorded lessons. He stumbled and let the child correct him. Ruby's little finger would wag with authority, and she would sign in a pleased, bossy way, "No, Daddy, like this." And Daniel would laugh, the sound unclenching something in his chest. Lena and Daniel occasionally corrected each other, not to shame, but to refine. Lena taught him a particular facial grammar that turned a question into a soft, expectant invitation. Daniel practiced the expression in front of the bathroom mirror until his smile felt like the right shape. There were small, tender embarrassments. Daniel once tried to sign family with a motion that was too cinematic, and Ruby burst into giggles at his overemphasis. Lena corrected the rhythm with a short, easy sign, the kind you give when you are forgiving and invested. She did not fix him, she welcomed him. That distinction mattered. They learned each other's hesitations. For Lena, there were nights when crowded rooms frayed her patience, and when she opted out, not because she feared people, but because she conserved her energy for work she believed in. Daniel learned to read those marginal signals, a tightened jaw before an office party, a pause at the thought of long meetings. He learned to step back, to make space, and to provide quiet alternatives. Staying home with Ruby and a film with closed captions, for instance, or bringing a portable chair to events where seating was awkward. For the city, the sight of them walking, Lena's hand often finding Ruby's, Daniel's sleeve bunched like the steady anchor of a man who had been apprenticed in steadiness, became a small, private proof that kindness had texture. People would sometimes watch them with casual interest, a stockbroker pausing mid-commute, an elderly neighbor making way in the park. The trio was not ostentatious. They were deliberate. There were also harder nights. One winter, a day where rain made the city a gray smear, Daniel received an anonymous online message that dredged up old cruelties. The message was a crude compilation, old photos stitched together with commentary, meant to ridicule Lena's shyness and the corporate scandal. It arrived in the early evening like a small stone thrown at the window. Daniel did what he always did. He stepped back from the particular heat of his own reaction. He read the note, and then he read it again in the light of what he wanted to teach Ruby about courage. He brought the device to the kitchen, sat at the table with Lena and Ruby, folded the sleeves back, and asked if Lena wanted to see. She did. She watched the images scroll and then signed one precise sign that it would be easier to move past this now than to accumulate it into a festival of anger. They sat together, made hot cocoa, and burned the day's anger into a pile of good family ritual, popcorn and a movie with closed captions. The small domestic acts did not erase harm, they made a shelter from it. With time, Lena found subtle ways to become part of the structure of Daniel and Ruby's life. She volunteered at Ruby's school as a literacy assistant, helping teachers craft lesson plans that included captioned video and tactile learning devices.
She and Ruby once constructed a cardboard dinosaur cave in the living room that became their annual ritual, a place for grand stories and imperfect cookies. The Triceratops was never far from the edges of their life. It sometimes sat on the mantel as if supervising. Lena's career continued to move forward. The nonprofit work she loved remained central. Daniel's company, having restructured its approach to public image, invited her to consult on an accessibility initiative. She accepted with a caution that was all her own, and the company listened in a new way. Her recommendations, small infrastructure changes, revised event protocols, accessible copy in all marketing material, were practical and low cost, yet profoundly meaningful. Each alteration made daily life easier for people who had been peripheral in the company's previous thinking. One afternoon, months after the incident, Daniel took Lena and Ruby to the Riverside Park where they'd first imagined togetherness as a possibility. It was late spring. The trees were an insistence of green, and the river moved with a confident, measured pace. They brought sandwiches and a frisbee that Ruby insisted on throwing with dramatic intensity. They baked, later that afternoon, a set of cookies that were half-burnt and fully adored. Ruby signed yum, and then signed again, faster, because she loved to watch Lena and Daniel attempt to be the grown-ups of the kitchen. That is where Daniel found the shape for what he wanted to ask. He did not want fireworks. He did not want a gilded ring box in a public setting. He wanted a scene that honored the private labor they'd done. The dinners where Lena had explained policy. The nights Daniel had taught Ruby a new sign. The afternoons where the Triceratops roared as clockwork. On the one-year anniversary of that night at Riverside Grill, Daniel planned something small and particular. He arranged with the restaurant to reserve the same table, not as an anchor to the past, but as a quiet punctuation mark. He asked them to bring the same embroidered handkerchief folded in a drawer, a small nod toward the continuity that matters. He did not tell Lena that he would propose. He wanted her to be surprised in the kind of way that was a deep yes rather than a spontaneous collapse. They arrived early. The restaurant's windows caught the golden hour like a hand cupped around a candle. Ruby, wearing a homemade paper crown, walked like a small monarch. She had insisted on bringing the Triceratops, of course, and declared during the walk that she would be the official best helper. Lena wore a dress with sleeves that moved with her hands, as if to make signing easy. Daniel carried, in his pocket, a small ring and a letter he had written to both Lena and Ruby, a letter that spoke less of perfection than of intention. They sat, and conversation flowed in the easy, weathered way of people who had built a life in the small moments.
Daniel spoke about board meetings, Lena about a successful campaign that had helped a city install better curb cuts. Ruby, in between cupfuls of fries, signed and spoke in the mingled mode of the young bilingual. "Do you remember when Daddy couldn't make bedtime without making a face?" she asked, mischievous. Daniel mock-offended and made the face anyway, and Lena laughed, signing a retort that made Ruby clap. As dessert arrived, the restaurant dimmed the lights to a softer, protective glow. Daniel folded the letter from his pocket and gave a copy to Lena, asking her to read first. She did, her eyes moving from lines to the cadence of his handwriting, her fingers occasionally touching the margin as if to anchor the ink in the air. The letter was simple. It spoke of a man who had learned how to make room, of a daughter who had taught him tenderness, and of a woman who had chosen to build not because she needed rescue, but because she believed in ordinary kindness. When Lena finished reading, she looked up. Daniel took her hands in his. He did not kneel. There was no theater. But he did slow the world with the kind of deliberate sincerity that had become the grammar of his life. He spoke aloud, softly, and then signed as well, his fingers finding a steadiness that came from practice. "Lena, would you marry us? Me and Ruby and all the small days we haven't yet had?" Ruby, who had been watching like a small judge of weather, signed without hesitation. She made the sign for Mary in a child's flourish, then leaned over and kissed Lena's cheek as if contract were already sealed. Lena's eyes filled, not with the kind of theatrical flood some stories demand, but with a quiet, resolute warmth. She signed back a short phrase that made Daniel's heart lift in the exact way a child's laugh does. "Yes," she said, and then she signed it, the meaning doubled and whole. They did not erupt into fireworks. The table near them smiled. The maitre d' pretended not to have arranged anything, his secret kept as if an accomplice had a right to the joy. The ring was slipped on like a small promise, not an act of possession, but of joining. Ruby clapped, and the triceratops, pulled from under the table as always, roared triumphantly. The days that followed were not miraculous so much as patient. They spoke with lawyers about housing and logistics. They met with pediatricians to map the gentle seam that forms when two homes become one for a child. They argued, sometimes, about where to hang a painting or how to complicate a schedule. They made a house that had room for mismatched cups and volunteer flyers, for a bookshelf that included both grown-up tomes and a stack of dinosaur board books. Lena continued her career. Daniel continued his work. Both of them learned a new language of compromise, not sacrifice, but negotiation rooted in respect. Ruby taught new signs with the possessive glee of a child who had patented a family. At company events, Lena sometimes appeared as a guest. She told stories about small design changes that felt like miracles simply because they were simple. A folder labeled with large print fonts, an AV setup with captions, a door held open with intention. Colleagues listened not as spectators, but as apprentices to practices that broadened how the world worked. Daniel stood in the back at these sessions, hands folded, the sort of proud that had nothing performative in it, only a steady recognition that to grow required humility. The men who had plotted the prank moved into different trajectories. Kyle's resignation allowed him, in the months that followed, to take a job consulting at a small firm where metrics mattered less than relationships. He wrote a piece later about misread ambition and how it creates monsters when the mirror of office culture is unchecked. Bonnie restructured her life, finding work that fit her rather than chasing titles that had felt hollow. Max stayed at the company, later speaking before a group about the human cost of measuring people only by numbers. Their own reckonings were uneven and real. Some days they were better, some days less so. That was, in Daniel's view, the work. People given the chance to change, not to be destroyed by their worst decisions.
A few years later, during a summer picnic where the city seemed to have arranged itself for kindness, the three of them sat on a blanket with the horizon of tamed city behind them. Ruby was older now, hands deft in sign language and speech equally bright. She built a small castle from found sticks, protecting it fiercely as she described its diplomatic protocols in a quick mixture of signed and spoken words. Lena and Daniel watched, each with the private gratitude of parents who had lost and then found again in new shapes. The Triceratops sat in the grass like an honored relic. The embroidered handkerchief, now a familiar artifact, sat folded on the blanket, its thread faint but present. It had become, in a quiet way, an emblem, not of a single night, but of the ordinary acts that stitch lives together. They had not escaped grief. Daniel's late wife remained a memory that lived in small rituals, the call at bedtime, the songs that drifted through the kitchen, and they honored that without needing it to be the shape of their future. They practiced inclusion not as a show but as a habit, inviting neighbors with different needs, making room at the table, learning a new sign when a friend needed it. Years of steady practice had taught them the right balance between protecting private life and being visible about what mattered. Daniel's leadership at work had shifted from press-ready compassion to a quieter, more effective insistence that policy matched rhetoric. Lena's work continued to ripple outward into policy changes that reached beyond any single company.
Ruby grew into a child who could walk both the familiar paths of concrete and the new ones of deliberate kindness. In the park, when the wind moved and made the Triceratops bow slightly, Ruby signed a little thing she had learned, an informal blessing she handed like a coin, and tucked it into Daniel's palm. He turned it over, feeling the light press of paper, and then looked up at Lena. They were a small, chosen family moving through a city that sometimes made space and sometimes did not. They were not perfect. They had built a place nonetheless. In the end, what the camera had almost captured was not a moment of humiliation, but the beginning of a quieter proof that a person in a position to punish could instead design repair, and that repair could be an act of dignity. Daniel had stood up for Lena not as a spectacle, but as a refusal to let someone else's cruelty become the architecture of their lives. He had chosen, in language and in action, to make right with patience and to invite others into work that lasted beyond headlines. They sat together on the blanket as evening gathered, the river a dark ribbon behind them. A few feet away, someone strummed a guitar, and a distant couple argued over dessert with the exaggerated intimacy of long-term affection. Lena leaned her head on Daniel's shoulder, a small, natural move, and Ruby pushed the Triceratops between them like an ambassador. Daniel folded the embroidered handkerchief into his pocket as he had the first night, a private shape of continuity. They had become, by slow degrees, chosen family, three people who had decided daily to be present for each other's needs and to make room for others in the process. They argued, they mended, they learned new signs, and they taught each other how to stay. That, more than anything else, was the quiet proof against cynicism, that kindness could be tested and still remain true when it was habitual and not performative. If this story moved you, like, share, and subscribe for more true-to-heart tales.